Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 2 for PC, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series S and X. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a stealth-oriented first-person shooter and the sequel to Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts. It was developed and published by CI Games, or City Interactive if you're not familiar with them, and was first released for PC, PS4, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S in June of this year, with the PlayStation 5 release following in August. Like its predecessor, it got a fairly mixed reception, although it did trend a bit more towards the positive than the negative, and while some of the criticism was aimed at some of the same issues that Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 had, the only major new criticism was mostly leveled at things like the game's microtransactions, which are certainly quite annoying, although they're definitely not a deal-breaker either. This is, after all, a single-player only game, and none of the DLC is actually required to be able to play through the entire thing. I don't have any of the DLCs at all, or any of the microtransactions that were criticized here. So I can't really speak for what they add to the game, but I can tell you they don't really seem to detract anything from it either, other than just being kind of an annoying thing that they tacked onto the game just because they felt like they had to put microtransactions in it. There is, however, one thing I want to mention before I go any further in this video, and that is that if you have not seen my Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 review, you should stop watching this video and go watch the Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 review first, because Ghost Warrior Contracts 2 is such an iterative sequel that it might as well be a standalone expansion pack to Ghost Warrior Contracts 1. Mechanically, they are nearly identical, just with some slight tweaks here and there and a bit of extra equipment for you to mess around with. The main changes are with regards to the setting and the story and the level design. They also did tweak the visuals a bit, which I will talk about in a moment, but suffice to say, since this game is so similar to Ghost Warrior Contracts 1, I feel like it's counterproductive if I just retread all over the ground that I've already tread on in that particular review. So again, if you have not seen that review, go watch that first. Then once you've seen that and you understand where I'm coming from on Ghost Warrior Contracts 1, you'll understand what I'm talking about with regards to 2. So, with that warning out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and just start delving right into this thing and see what exactly we're dealing with here, and whether or not it has improved or slid back from the previous game. Now, like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Cryengine like its predecessor, and it uses that engine to pretty good effect for the most part. It's got some pretty good modeling, it's got some pretty good texture quality, and it does have some very nice post-processing effects, lighting effects, and things like that. And they've even changed up the gore effects, so now when you get headshots, there's a good chance that the head will partially fly apart into this kind of mushy mess, and it's even more gruesome than the headshots were in the previous game, where they would just blow heads apart into a bunch of different chunks. Here you get the chunks, and you get the fleshy mass that was once their face, which certainly makes the game earn its M rating, but other than that, actually doesn't add all that much to the experience. The headshots were plenty satisfying enough in the previous game, and changing it up for this one actually didn't have much effect on it at all. It's not like this is the Sniper Elite series where you're getting X-ray views of all their organs and bones and such shattering as the bullet passes through. It's pretty hard to compete with that, let's be honest. Anyway, that said, they didn't really address one of the issues that the previous game had, which is that most of the enemies have their faces covered, and that is clearly so that they didn't have to animate their faces. You have the same exact effect of the enemies just nodding when they're having conversations, and it looking like something out of the early 2000s, if not the late 90s. Though certainly in a much higher resolution with much better models and textures and such. Now, all of that said, the game doesn't look so much better than its predecessor that it really justifies the fairly noticeable drop in performance. That's not to say that the game runs poorly, it certainly doesn't. It runs pretty decently, but you'll notice a lot more frame rate drops below 60 FPS in this one compared to the previous game, which generally stayed at or above 60 FPS most of the time. And it's not always clear exactly what is causing the frame rate drops. You might notice it sometimes in large areas with a bunch of stuff being rendered. You might notice it in some smaller areas where there's not all that much being rendered. It's just a bit of a crapshoot as to when the frame rate drops are going to happen, so it seems like there are a few optimization issues that they really should sort out. Aside from that, while there are quite a few new weapons for you to mess around with, a lot of them are very similar to the ones in the previous game, and you will notice a lot of asset reuse in terms of character models, in terms of environmental models, in terms of the animations especially, and it does make the game very much feel like a standalone expansion rather than a full sequel. It even does the same style of cutscenes when you go into a mission and you get your briefing. It's all very familiar if you have played the previous game, which is not necessarily a bad thing. There is a philosophy of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and they have clearly gone for that here. That said, I would have liked to see them address some of the issues I had with the visuals in the previous game, and it would have been especially nice if they could actually sort out the optimization issues that I was running into, although some of that might just be that my computer is starting to get on in years, and it's no longer a top-of-the-line machine. That said, at 1080p I shouldn't be running into problems in the first place. Anyway, moving on to sound design, it's also more or less in the same vein as the previous game. The sound effects all work pretty well for the most part. They're not especially great, but they all do their job reasonably enough, and they're satisfying enough in things like gun and explosion sounds that you won't be thinking your guns all sound like pea shooters. At the same time, they don't sound especially powerful either, so that's a bit disappointing. Moving on to the music, with the change in setting going from the previous game, which was set in a fictional Siberian state, to this one, which is set in a fictional Middle Eastern state, they changed up the music to be a bit more fitting with the setting, and it works fine. There's nothing especially impressive about it, but it all fits the game pretty well, and at certain times when the music is going, you get a pretty decent sense of atmosphere out of the game. But then there's the voice acting, and that changes it pretty significantly depending on which characters you're talking about. If you're talking about the main character that you play as, Raven, he's pretty bland and doesn't really have anything going on other than just being a fairly standard tough guy mercenary, and his handler falls into that generic British Special Forces voice category. Despite them falling into the fairly generic categories, they do their roles pretty well. There's nothing especially egregious about their performances, it's just that they're not particularly impressive either. But then there are all of the random soldiers that you're going to be dealing with, and they have a nasty problem of tending to repeat the same conversations over and over and over again, and the same basically 2 or 3 voices repeating constantly for every single one of them. And you can only hear so much of that before you just start tuning it out entirely. So when you bring it all together, you end up with a presentation that mostly stays the same quality as the previous game, which is pretty good quality for the most part. It's just that they improved some of the visuals here and there, and they lost some of the performance by comparison. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as a mercenary codenamed Raven, and you are sent into the fictional Middle Eastern country of Kuamar in order to take down its de facto leader, who is overseeing a corrupt and brutal regime that is oppressing the people of Kuamar, and ultimately try to prevent a war that will not only destabilize the entire region, but will also have a devastating effect on the global economy as a result. But while your primary target is this corrupt dictator, Bibi Rashida, it's not just gonna be a one-and-done affair. You need to also dismantle all of the operations that give that regime power, and to that end you're going to be sabotaging certain key locations and taking out certain key individuals as you work your way up towards taking down Bibi Rashida. Along the way, you will be fed information and given advice by your handler, and you are both working for this strange shadow organization that is trying to steer global politics in certain directions. Now, while with most shadow organizations trying to steer global politics, you get a very negative connotation, they make it pretty abundantly clear throughout the entire game that the organization you're working for is trying to do things from a more benevolent standpoint, and that all of the target individuals you are sent to eliminate are really terrible people up to really terrible things. We're talking massive crimes against humanity, among other things. And thus, needless to say, the world is a much better place without them. Now the thing is that this is all set up for what you're actually going to be doing throughout the course of the game, and you find out very quickly that much like the previous Sniper Ghost Warrior, you really don't get much beyond that setup. I mean, sure, you'll be going about your missions and completing them, but there's never really any major plot that happens during any of the missions, and the only real cutscenes you're getting are just briefings, and they give you some vague idea of what your previous mission accomplished, but you never really see that play out in the game itself. Now, of course, if this were a more linear and story-driven game, that would be a really nasty problem. But this is not a very linear, story-driven game. It is more linear than the previous game, and I will get to that more in a moment. But each of the missions is relatively open-ended in that you can complete the objectives in more or less any order that you want, and it's really entirely about the gameplay of going through these missions, taking out these targets, and completing all the other objectives along the way. So what exactly are you doing in Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 2? Well, you're doing basically the exact same thing you were doing in Ghost Warrior Contracts 1. You start out at the mission select screen, you select the area you're going to drop into, you select your loadout, and then you drop into that area and you are free to complete the objectives in any order that you wish. As you complete objectives and optional challenges, you will get amounts of currency that you can spend on buying new equipment for your loadout, whether that be just extra gear or attachments for your existing weapons or of course new weapons, and you will also gradually earn points that you can throw into an upgrade tree that will upgrade your stealth capabilities or expand the capabilities of your drone or allow you to do melee takedowns on heavies or allow you to carry more ammunition and things like that. And the more difficult or specific the challenges are that you complete, the higher the rewards are going to be, and thus the more equipment and attachments and such you're going to be able to purchase. You can also find collectibles as you wander around that will give you things like camo paint jobs for your weapons, as well as intel points you can spend along with the in-game currency on some of the higher tier weaponry that is a bit more specialized, but is also highly effective. And in fact, all of the equipment that you have access to is effective in some form. Even the lighter sniper rifles that don't really have as much power or long-range capability are still very usable in nearly all of the situations. They do advise you that for certain missions where you know you're going to be reaching out to much longer ranges, you're going to want a heavy sniper rifle as opposed to a light sniper rifle, but a medium one can usually bridge the gap between both the shorter range missions and the longer range missions. It is certainly easier to tackle the long-range missions with the heavy sniper rifles because you have a bit less bullet drop to compensate for, and the scopes are generally much longer range, so it makes it a lot easier to see your targets. But with the right attachments and the right scopes especially, you can also make medium sniper rifles work pretty effectively in those situations as well. I wouldn't really advise doing it with light sniper rifles though. Like in all of the previous Sniper Ghost Warrior games, you need to compensate for bullet drop, the wind, you need to compensate for the range that you're reaching out to by adjusting the range increments on your scope, and of course if you have a moving target then you need to compensate for that as well. While the developers act like this is unparalleled realism compared to how it's previously been in the series, it's really not any different in that regard than Ghost Warrior Contracts 1, which was fine, there was nothing wrong with that. And you have this augmented reality mask that allows you to mark targets and see how far they are away from you, and also see the trajectory that your bullets are going to be falling on, which all of course helps you line up those shots much more effectively. It is also worth noting that the higher difficulty you put the game on, the less assistance you get in that regard. On the lower difficulties, you'll have a red indicator as to where the shot's actually going to land, but on higher difficulties, you don't get that red indicator. I was playing on Veteran Sniper, which is the second highest difficulty, basically just the hard mode, and thus I would get the general trajectory that the bullet was going to fall on, but I didn't get the red indicator, and that was more than enough to give the game a fair bit of challenge as far as lining up shots. Here's the thing though, that's all going to be very familiar to you if you played Ghost Warrior Contracts 1. So what do they do differently in 2? Well, they changed up the equipment that you're using, so you're using some different guns compared to the previous game, although most of them are pretty similar, and they do give you a new remote sniper rifle turret that you can set up and then mark targets for and take them down with, but it has a relatively limited range, and you have to spend some upgrade points to be able to get it suppressed, so if you don't have it suppressed, then it's going to make a lot of noise, which is going to draw a lot of attention, and as such I found it to just be more effective to go around with a suppressed pistol or a suppressed carbine, or even just a suppressed sniper rifle, and just take care of pretty much everything myself. So in this situation, the remote sniper rifle turret is certainly a cool idea, it's just that it doesn't really have all that much practical use. Aside from the changes in weapons and the new sniper rifle turret, however, they didn't really do all that much to the mechanics of this game to really differentiate it from the previous one. The most changes you're going to notice are in things like the level design, where it is more linear than it was in the previous game. You have less options for wandering around the area and finding different ways of approaching objectives than you did in the previous one. On the one hand, this results in slightly more tightly designed encounters, but it also reduces your options and therefore makes the game a bit less interesting than the previous one. At the same time, however, they have split the missions themselves into different categories. So you have classic missions, which are more or less like they were in Ghost Warrior Contracts 1, and then you have the long-range missions, which are specifically designed around very long-range engagements, where you set up your heavy sniper rifle a really long distance away, and you make shots that have quite a bit of travel time and are pretty satisfying to pull off. And when everything's firing on all cylinders, the game actually can be quite a lot of fun, much like its predecessor, where you get those really satisfying long-range shots, you get those missions where you do actually manage to pull off a proper stealth infiltration, nobody knows you're there, or very few noticed you're there, and those that did notice aren't talking anymore, and you can sometimes even eliminate targets in a bit of a creative manner. The game does give you some options in that regard, in some instances. The problem is that, as I said, this is a more linear game than the previous one. It is still open-ended to some degree, but your ways into and out of mission areas are more limited, and pretty much everywhere you go there is an anti-drone tower that's going to make your drone effectively useless. In fact, there were so many anti-drone towers in this game that I actually didn't use the drone at all for nearly the entire game. And once you get a bit further into the game, it starts introducing more and more jammers, which will also interfere with the marking that you can do with your visor. I know these are supposed to introduce some extra challenge and difficulty to the situation, but they really don't. All they do is generally annoy you because you're given less options for scouting out the area and preparing. And when you're already pretty limited on what options you have for going into an area, that doesn't really help matters. And speaking of not helping matters, there is the enemy AI, which really hasn't seen any improvement since Ghost Warrior Contracts 1. Enemies range from either being basically brain-dead stupid, to being able to spot you from a mile away with pinpoint accuracy and direct not only mortar fire, but assault rifle shots at you from that distance. And if you miss a shot, or heaven forbid you actually hit what you were aiming at, but an enemy was anywhere remotely near it, then an alarm will be sounded and every single enemy in the entire area will immediately start looking for you and probably will find you in very short order, which gets pretty frustrating. And eventually, you will probably end up in the same position I was, where you just say screw it and adopt the position of, well, you can be stealthy if there's nobody left on the map who can spot you. But of course, that comes with its own frustrations, namely the fact that you really can't take all that much damage, so if you do get in a stand-up fight with any of the soldiers, you need to be pretty careful, because they can take you down in very short order if you're not careful. And since this game doesn't operate on a save anywhere feature and rather operates on checkpoint saves, that means you can lose a fair bit of progress if you screw something up, or the enemy just suddenly spots you even though you were hiding pretty effectively. And when you bring it all together, you end up with a game that is basically a lateral progression from Ghost Warrior Contracts 1. Sure, they put it in a different setting, they gave it a different story, and they made a few changes to the level design, but fundamentally you're still dealing with the same game. It's just that the level design is a bit less open-ended and a bit more structured, with the intent clearly being on trying to make certain elements of the gameplay shine a bit more, but the end result is just basically more of the same. If you liked Ghost Warrior Contracts, you'll like Ghost Warrior Contracts 2. But you might be pretty disappointed if you go into this thing with the expectation that it was going to improve the series like Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 did. Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 was the first game in the entire Ghost Warrior series that you could actually say worked pretty well. The first game was an absolute mess, the second game was an absolute mess, the third game was just trying way too hard to be a AAA game, and then they scaled things back for Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 and took on more of a Hitman-esque gameplay style, and that actually worked really well for it. It wasn't perfect, of course, I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5, but it was the first game in the series that I could say was actually fairly decent and was worth playing. Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, on the other hand, is just a lateral move. It's not an improvement, but nor is it really a step back. They kept the core of what made Ghost Warrior Contracts 1 work, but they didn't really do anything truly new or exciting with it. They just made a few tweaks here and there and ended up with basically the same level of quality as the original Ghost Warrior Contracts, and that's fine to some degree, but some of us were hoping that the series would actually continue to move forward and really start to hit its stride instead of just treading water like this did. That's not to say that Ghost Warrior Contracts 2 isn't worth playing. After all, if you liked Ghost Warrior Contracts 1, you will certainly like Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, and if you're concerned about the amount of content in it, I ended up with about a 12-ish hour playthrough, including the extra mission that they added in as a free update. So there is a pretty decent amount of content here, and they're not selling it for AAA price. They're selling it for $40 MSRP, although they do have a fair few extra weapon packs as well as a bunch of extra weapons skins that you can get on top of that, so your mileage may vary depending on whether you want to get the entire game with all of its DLC, all of which, it is very much worth saying, is completely optional and is not at all required to be able to enjoy the game. Because apart from the actual weapon packs, it's all entirely cosmetic, and thus can all be safely avoided. And they give you a pretty good variety of weapons in the game to begin with, so you certainly don't need the weapon packs either. Although frankly, the sheer amount of skin packs for the game is a bit tasteless, considering that this is entirely a single-player game. So that is certainly a bit annoying, but overall, as I said, this is basically on the same quality tier as the original Ghost Warrior Contracts, and as such, I'm going to give it the same exact score, a 3 out of 5. It's a decent enough game, especially if you can get it on sale for a good discount, but just don't go into it expecting any major leaps forward for the Sniper Ghost Warrior series, and if you've played the original Ghost Warrior Contracts, you will certainly enjoy Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, but you'll probably still be getting a fair amount of deja vu from it. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like my reviews or any of my other kinds of videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.